Jim Potham is a very well-known educational assessment person in the USA. And many years ago I heard him do a very funny presentation at ARA in the USA. And he talked about the PAGA syndrome, P-A-A-G-A-A. And he said that's about giving papers, putting in an abstract, promise them anything in April, give them anything in August. When I looked at the title for the presentation today, I thought, oh, I'm not sure that's actually an area of my strength now that I look at it. And thought about it some more, and then I thought, it has to become what I consider is my area of strength. And that really is about assessment and understanding learning and equity. So Michelle and I today are going to be talking to you about some analyses that reflect reading and writing for students in Year 3 in 2011 and Year 5 in 2013 on the NAPLAN tests. So we're not going beyond Year 5, but our basic philosophy is how students do in Years 3 and 5 underpins Years 6 to 9, and we also have other analyses we're doing which are more longitudinal, which are showing in fact the impact of Year 3 and Year 5 outcomes on Year 7 and Year 9. So these are the students who last year would have sat NAPLAN in Year 9 and will finish school in 2020. So as an introduction, we do have two parts to our presentation or presentations. I'm really focusing on, if we're looking at improvement and differentiating, then the critical question is differentiation in terms of what and for whom. So the focus is on reading and writing. We'll look at Australian curriculum, we'll look at NAPLAN, look at other external tests that people are using a lot in schools, and I will summarise then what we find in the national reports on schooling for NAPLAN results in reading and writing for the students of those years I mentioned. Michelle is going to take the data a step further. She's going to present multi-level analyses which will show you there are much more insights to be gained about student performance. So when we talk about differentiation, it'll have different meanings. But the Australian curriculum and the Melbourne Declaration both say that we need to have high expectations for all students, that we should be having quality outcomes and expectations for all, and that we should be adapting learning practices to suit the needs of all students. We're also expected to be preparing students for the 21st century with a wide range of capabilities and skills that are not reflected necessarily in some of our core curriculum content. The Melbourne Declaration also asks for world-class assessment practices, incorporating assessment for, as, and of learning. So differentiation to meet the needs of all students is a very high expectation on any teacher with a class of 25 students whether in primary school or teaching many students in secondary school in their subject specialisations. So diversity's got many forms. It can be students who are recognised as having different cultural backgrounds, having disadvantaged backgrounds. It might be students with disability. It might be students who identify as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, or students who have English as an additional language or dialect, as we refer to it in Queensland, or LBOT as it is in the traditional national reports. So looking at these students, how do we know what their progression is and how might we improve their learning for all different types of students? Now when you look at the Australian curriculum, and I know many here will be very familiar with it, you will all have seen the section on addressing student diversity. And basically it says that the propositions of the Australian curriculum include that each child can learn and the needs of every student are important, that every child is entitled to the knowledge and skills they need for successful lifelong learning, that we have the high expectations, and that teachers can account for the current level of learning of individual students and the different rates at which students develop. Finally, that the needs and interests of students will vary and schools will plan from the curriculum in ways that respond to those needs and interests. So what you have there is a sense that you have students with diversity, but in fact it's very much focused within a singular curriculum, if you like. So what do we know? Teachers are expected to identify where students are in their learning, and that would be drawing on some framework. They have to plan learning to take into account learning of the area content. That's within the curriculum. And they should consider students' personal context and interests. So very much tailoring what they're going to teach students to who the student is. But how to do this, and no doubt what you all came along today hoping to hear, is very limited in terms of guidance. So the expectations are set, the goals are set, it's framed within high expectations for everybody, it's framed within teachers addressing student diversity, but the how-to within the curriculum is limited. If you go beyond the student diversity framework provided in the Australian curriculum, you'll find it's actually fairly limited. But to me, the core question actually becomes, if we're looking at identifying learning progress, what's the framework against which we are actually going to look at that progress? How are we actually structuring what progress is? So I have an interest in learning, I have some interest in cognition, and I have an interest in assessment. But always it comes back to what is it we expect students to learn and how will we know if they've got there? So we know that NAPLAN data are expected to provide evidence of students' literacy achievement in all of these areas, and diagnostic data, and the extent to which it's identified as diagnostic for individual students, will always depend on what version of you're reading on the web about what NAPLAN is for and what the evidence and the data are for. But there is a sense that NAPLAN will give you some guidance about student improvement and where they should go. But we also have noticed in research, the evidence is emerging that Queensland teachers are becoming data literate to an extent, which is very compatible with the ILSTE Standard 5 and 5.4, with which my colleagues are very, very keen to focus. And in fact, they're starting to say, oh, we need data and evidence to actually demonstrate learning, and they're collecting a lot of data and evidence that they can actually demonstrate or map student progress. So that could be, in addition to their own classroom assessments, data on NAPLAN, data on the progressive achievement tests in reading, the test of reading comprehension, TORCH, and the PM benchmarks. And these are just a few of the different external test forms and systems that teachers are currently using in schools. They're also using a range of programs that might be encourage them to teach a unit for 3 weeks and test again, thinking that that is a form of formative assessment. It is not, it is pre-test, post-test, and surprise, if students have been taught what the unit is, they do better. Whether they retain it is a different issue. But why don't we look at how learning progressions are actually represented in these different forms of evidence that teachers are collecting. So I want to start with the Australian curriculum, looking at reading and writing. But reading and writing are embedded within quite complex structures. So we've got receptive modes, listening, reading and viewing. And we've got productive modes, speaking, writing and creating. So we might think, well, reading is there as reading, and writing and creating are there as writing and creating. So I don't expect you to read this, but this is from the Australian curriculum. And after actually initially looking at all of the components of the curriculum and the various levels and the descriptors, this is basically from the expected standards that students should achieve. So these are the expected standards for years 3, 4 and 5, and they're relevant because they're the age group of students we're looking at. So what you have here for reading or for receptive modes are the very rich, if complex, descriptions we'd be expecting of listening engagement, of literacy engagement, including reading. And they very much demonstrate multimodal levels of reading. They also demonstrate different ways in which students might be able to demonstrate what they know or can do. So progression in terms of reading comprehension, there's a bit italicized there, appears to be complexity of sentences of texts, understanding of text purpose, direct and inferential reading, and different types of text. So across reading within the expectations for years 3 to 5, you see an increase in complexity on a fairly small number of elements in the context of a much richer data set of what might be receptive modes. If we look at writing, then we have again rich, complex understandings of production. We have writing and creating might relate to NAPLAN, both of those elements. And within this expected standards for students at each of these year levels, we see progression appears to include understanding, use, relaying events, use of images and detail, points of view, developing grammar vocabulary, and punctuation, spelling, and editing and cohesion. So by the time you get down here, you've got students rereading and editing their work for appropriate vocabulary, structure and meaning, and they can write. We've got handwriting in year 3. They write using joined letters that are accurately formed and consistent in size. When we get to year 5, when writing, they've got demonstrate understanding of grammar, a variety of sentence types. They select specific vocabulary and use accurate spelling and punctuation. And they have cohesive structure and meaning. So we have got elements coming through the Australian curriculum, expected standards of what progression might look like. So when we're talking about differentiation, are we talking about differentiating on these aspects for students to inform their instruction? In which case, how we're going to assess them. So that's the Australian curriculum expected standards. Not all of the body of the Australian curriculum, which, as you know, is very complex indeed. So the Australian Curriculum Literacy Continuum is also available on the ACARA website. It has comprehending text through listening, reading and viewing. So again, we've got the reading component coming through. And this talks about what students might do. These 2 examples of progression are students at level 2, typically by the end of year 2, and level 3, typically at the end of year 4. Now, at one stage for NAPLAN, it was said that year 3 test was testing essentially what was expected by the end of year 2, and also some more complex questions for students to show what they could do. And the same for level 3. NAPLAN for year 5 was meant to be at what was expected at the end of year 4 for all students, plus some more complex sentences. So again, we've got navigate, read and view, different types of text with illustrations and more detailed graphics. We have listening. We have interpret little information. So here we have a progression that again reflects that strong multimodal notion of what literacy is, with components of what might be reading comprehension, somewhat similar and aligned to the Australian curriculum, but slightly different and simplified. For writing and creating, we still have that rich portrayal of literacy and learning for students and different ways of engaging with presentations. And I know Queensland has its own literacy continuum, but unfortunately that's closed to outsiders, so I couldn't use that to compare how this continuum went. What's interesting in the writing areas, both in the Australian curriculum and here, is that notion of writing in different range of learning areas. So writing is something which Claire and I once said there are curriculum literacies. There is writing across different areas, it's not just writing in English. So the literacy continuum addresses the notion of writing across areas. So here we have a similar, but again a slightly different progression. So when we're looking at students' improvement, are we going to go for the Australian Curriculum Detail, the Australian Curriculum Expected Standards, the Australian Curriculum Literacy Continuum, pulling out what we think might be reading and writing. Very complex frameworks to use for students. Now what's interesting about these is that the curriculum is presented as this body of knowledge, a gradation body of knowledge that you go through. You might go through at your own rate, which is the Australian Curriculum ACARA statement, but the expectation is you're going to progress through this same body of knowledge. There's not much within the descriptors about how students might differ, or whether you're going to focus on different outcomes for different students. Really, it's about one learning progression, even if they do differ across those different frameworks. And we have a question, so is learning progression really just one tree of knowledge? Is it branching knowledge, or different knowledges? So how do we actually identify the impact of cultural knowledge on engagement with whichever of these progressions we might take with the ones I've presented so far, how do we engage with different ways of knowing that might affect how students can actually present what they can do in different ways? And the multimodality of our current literacy description certainly suits different ways of demonstrating what you can do. So within the classroom that's possible, it doesn't translate into the other data we get. So what is learning progression? How are we going to define it? And how are we going to use it? So then I thought it was interesting to have a look at the tests that people are frequently using. Now, how many people here are teachers? I can't get a show of hands from people. And how many of you might have used PATR? Yeah. Commonly used in schools. So what's the demonstration, what's the learning progression shown in PATR? So PATR is described, now I've used the 3rd edition, 2013, they're only up to the 5th edition now. They're tests designed to assist teachers in assessment of students' reading comprehension skills, vocabulary, knowledges and spelling. So we've got 3 areas we're working on. So it's structured so the skills across a wide variety of year levels can be assessed validly, and the tests have been developed especially but not exclusively for use in Australian schools. Now PATR, as you know, have been around for a very long time. They preceded the Australian curriculum. So they're not necessarily a learning progression that's tied to the Australian curriculum or tied to Australian students or tied to the same learning progression. And this is what PATR describes as reading skills. So you've got the directly stated information, you've got reflecting on text, interpreting explicit information and interpreting by making inferences. So gradually we keep reducing what we think literacy might be to what can be assessed by the form of assessment that we're using. So we have inferential comprehension, contemporary understandings of the reading process. So the interesting thing about contemporary understandings of the reading process is how does that match with what's in the Australian curriculum, what's in the expected standards, what's in the literacy continuum, what might be in the Queensland continuum or other continuum, and then we've got them here. So what PATR will provide an estimate of students' level of reading comprehension, vocabulary skills and spelling skills based on students' performance. So they're compared with other students that they've actually normed the test on. There's no detail in the manual I had about the students who participated in the norms. It's got numbers and it's got year levels, but it doesn't actually say what the background or characteristics were of the students. So you have to be schools willing to be participating in the norms. So you have norms. They have qualitative descriptors that are provided against those norms. And these descriptors, for example, this is a student who's in year 4 but not doing very well. So this year 4 student, bearing in mind what might be the expected standard for level 3 under the literacy continuum, they can deal with a range of text types containing unfamiliar topics. They identify a synonymous match to an explicitly stated piece of information, dealing with some organisational complexity to locate the information. They can bear and combine information from different parts. They recognise an idea implied by scattered prominent clues, identify the likely context text was produced, and deal with it. So from this type of thing, the students, level 4, percentile low and stay 9.3. So the students about here for their year level. So the question to me is, what sort of learning progression is this portraying in schools? How does it align with the Australian curriculum, the expected standards, literacy continuum, and the Queensland continuum? So what do we know about a student from this? We have that descriptor, but does it really tell me where to go next? Am I really expecting that when I teach this student on a norm-referenced comparison, they're really going to improve? Because if everybody improves, the norms shift up. It's the whole fundamental principle of a norm-based curve. While they might give descriptors that appear to be criteria-based, they have come out of the items. It's not actually a distribution based on a learning progression that's drawn from what is knowledge. It's a range of items, they're scaled, they're set to a distribution, and then we find out what the students can do. So automatically, a bulk of your students are going to be around average, You test students on your PAT and they're around average. You test them again in 6 months' time, they might still be average. Does that mean they haven't improved, or does it mean the learning progression is not sufficiently detailed or fine to actually be showing you what a student can do? Then there's a torch. Now the torch was first developed in 1987. I've always been interested in the torch because I did a lot of work in adult literacy and numeracy, and it was very interesting because from that I came to understand the diversity of learning approaches that people have. And I don't mean learning styles, I mean learning approaches, what their strengths of knowledge were, how people could have real strengths in an area and have weaknesses in another. I remember asking a woman who was in a literacy and numeracy class, and I said, so have you got any strengths in mathematics or numeracy? She said, none, absolutely none. I said, do you like to play board games? She said, oh yes. What board games do you play? Monopoly. Do you have any strategies? Oh yes, I like to buy hotels so that I can win. She had absolutely no numeracy whatsoever. So she had failed school numeracy, but she had well and truly succeeded in life literacy and numeracy. So the torch has been around a very long time. In the early versions, it used to have a little rider that said, this test does not suit all people, because it was created in such a way that anybody who didn't fit doesn't get included, and this is common to these sorts of tests. So the people of most interest aren't necessarily represented in the learning hierarchies or progressions presented in these tests. It's calibrated with previous torch tests, the current version, that is the current version. Again, you get percentile ranks and stanines, the same graph as in the book, and you get that same thing. It's description of learning behaviour. This is a closed exercise, so it does take a bit more. But reading behaviours are locate information, find directly stated information or reword it, locate, interpret, infer, whether it's directly stated or indirectly stated, and infer and use. So again, it's a reduction of what might be literacy or a learning progression in terms of the Australian curriculum, the Australian curriculum expected standards, I'm not going into the detail there, or the continua. So which of these, if you're using Torch and PAT-R for students and NAPLAN and your school-based assessment, how are you actually creating the learning progression that you're going to use? Now the Torch does say now that the texts they use are representative of the Australian curriculum texts, and that the lower level they're more linked to familiar experiences, at higher levels they're more complex and challenging. So this is the extent to which I could find in the Torch manual that Torch actually aligns with the Australian curriculum. So if you're using Torch and you're using PAT-R, you're using this, what is this learning progression that you are differentiating your instruction to or student outcomes? Then the last one I just want to refer to is the PM benchmarks, which have been developed in New Zealand and Australia. They've been around for a while too. The advantage, for those of us who remember the Year 2 diagnostic net, they require one-to-one administration in general. So a teacher with a child, listening to the child read aloud, decode, retelling stories, analysing miscues, reading behaviours, and looking at knowledge and skills and guidelines for future development. So then we say, these are the type of reports you can get out of PM benchmarks. So this student, they give you she's a grade, they say she's at a level, she's reading these books, and they give you at least an analysis that the teacher has written about what they're observing as a student. So it's a much richer analysis of what a student is doing in reading, but it's not quite clear what their actual learning progression is, apart from what I identified on the page before. So how does that align with the Australian curriculum, the expected standards, literacy continua, and all the richnesses out there? Here at least you can see clear evidence about students reading or retelling or interpreting, comprehending, and it doesn't have to be written. These are in manuals, by the way, I've just reproduced the pages. And then that's the second page of the report. So this is obviously a running record for a student, and reading behaviours, identifying them. So there's a lot of information there that teachers can gain about an individual's actual reading and comprehension in the simplistic form. So in terms of the 3 external assessments I've looked at, You might say that is the richest in terms of what might be the learning progression. The interesting thing is when you look at the materials though, and you start to think, this is a suggestion for reading ages 5 to 6'5", so our very young readers. And they're saying, so we should be dealing with the familiar for them, familiar words, familiar contexts. So the first one is about toys. It says toys are often a source of comfort and security for children. And so the little bit of example text is, I cannot go to bed, said Sam. Little bear is not in bed. Where is he? Then the next up is meant to be students are getting concepts of time, distance and place. So on Saturday morning I had my first ride on a train. Next the train went into a long tunnel. I did not like it. And then the last example of high frequency words has, look Dad, said Kate, here is a cat. Oh Josh, cried Lily, you are all wet, you cannot sit by me. Or little hen and her 2 friends ran back to the house. That's a level 14, so we're getting quite up there. Now, I don't think I need to point out that this certainly reflects a certain cultural bias. For students who are in remote schools, in Queensland and elsewhere, not every town has a train. And even in towns that have trains, not every student will have been on one. Is there a problem with being wet if you actually like to jump into the river or the billabong all the time? Why is that an issue? So there are big issues in these little books, and this is just a sample provided in the manual, so I'm sure there are others that are more sufficient, but you just have to be very careful saying, well, what are we giving these students? First of all, we've got a learning progression, but then we actually don't get the context quite right for what we're presenting. And as we know, NAPLAN reading and writing have come across issues in terms of their prompts and topics. And it's very hard to find something that might be neutral. But these are particularly Caucasian, metropolitan-focused law groups. And I'm thinking of students who might be refugees. So not just Indigenous students, students who might be refugees, who've actually come out of traumatic experiences. And I just even thought, I'm pretty sure that there are some of those students that wouldn't actually even like to think about long tunnels and darkness. Because if you've seen the sorts of drawings that they present in their classes, they're often very dark. So we've got something that might give more information on teachers. It's still not clear about the learning progression, how it ties into the Australian curriculum. But if I am a teacher, how am I going to combine all these pieces of information? If I'm talking about differentiating and trying to find out how students are and diagnose their needs, look at their cultural background, where am I going to go? What am I going to attend to as my core learning progression, and how do I go? So I just thought I'd move on then to looking at what we currently have in terms of information about students and NAPLAN. So these are quite clearly stated, the NAPLAN progressions for reading. So in year 3, we have that reading texts have predictable text and sentence structures, words that may be unfamiliar are explained in the writing or through the accompanying illustrations, familiar everyday language. That actually doesn't seem a very high ask for year 3, does it? Because it's tied to the Australian curriculum, but it's actually not a very high ask. And that when they're reading, students can find directly stated information, that in year 5, getting into a range of genre, sentence structure may be varied. There might be unfamiliar vocabulary, but there'll be enough clues there to tell you what it's about. And the students can generally interpret ideas in simple text and make connections between ideas that are not stated. And they have a list of expectations in terms of different genre. I just pulled out the first one, which is a short narrative. We've got the locate directly, we've got the interpret, we can identify and we can engage with. So we have progressed down from that very rich notion of what is literacy from the Australian curriculum, so carefully crafted to be all of these elements and the ways that students might demonstrate learning, to what we have as a national data set looking at NAPLAN students in years 3 and 5, and here are our learning progressions, which are about that complexity of text and inference. All students will progress through the same pathway. So the same with writing, of course. Writing is quite different because we talk about students getting a variety of forms of writing. That students have been tested so far in narrative and persuasive writing. That the writing tasks target the full range of capabilities from years 3 to 9, and we use the same marking guide. So we don't have a progression outlined in the same way we have for reading. What we have is a marking guide with these 10 criteria. In fact, some of the analysis we'll be doing over the forthcoming 12 months will be looking at how these criteria relate in the longitudinal data sets we have for writing. So here are a couple of criteria, and these are the marking guides for writing. So if we look at level 1, minimal evidence of a narrative structure, a story beginning only, or a middle with no orientation, a recount of events, no complication. And if we look at level 2, contains a beginning and a complication where a resolution is present, it's weak, contrived or tacked on. And I'm trying to think to myself, what would that be the expected standard for? How does that actually match expected standards? I mean, is level 1 sort of not year 3, or is level 2, looks because it was a complication, it could be a little bit above year 3 in terms of the statements. Level 3 for text structure is getting more complex. And then 4 is coherent and complete and controlled with effective plot devices. So it's not it's a fairly contracted range to cover years 3 to 9 as a learning progression. And I look at that and I think in context, so I don't have the answers for you because I don't know how all of these different progressions actually merge together. That'll take a little bit more analysis, which I think I would like to do. And then if we look at ideas, we go from 1 is ideas are very few and very simple. 2 is predictable, up to level 5. Ideas are generated, selected and crafted to explore a recognisable theme. So what I want to say to you is when we're talking about differentiating instruction, when we're talking about differentiating learning for students, the starting point is deciding what is your framework, what is the evidence of the learning progressions, and what is the underlying learning theory. It's not something we see very present in our curriculum. So curriculum present content, but then what is the learning actual theory underpinning most of it for progression? And I think that's an area where everybody internationally, particularly in assessment, is starting to say we need to know more. The other thing we need to know more about is how teachers are combining data and using data to look at student learning. So just quickly, I'm going to look at the results that we have in NAPLAN for students as presented in the National Reports on Schooling for those 2 year levels. And we'll look at what sort of growth occurs. And we need to understand the impact of different forms of learning for students in different contexts. So these are the only data we have that actually give us some of that information. And I talk about learning progressions for the majority of students because not all students are going to fit these progressions. So very quickly, these students we're talking about in year 3 in reading, in Queensland they had a mean scale score of 497. As you know, it's a scaled score, so they might have got on average 14 out of 20 questions right, and that becomes 497. A bit lower than Australia, but no difference really. Year 5, actually there's an error in that table, isn't there? I've cut and pasted and I didn't actually correct it. Year 5 they've improved, but not much different. And the gain, which is correct, the actual National Report on Schooling for 2013 shows the gain in reading, which for Queensland 97.1 points on average for students over the 2 years of testing. So these are year 3 students in year 5, and NAPLAN report, of course, it's only students who sat both years of testing. So for year 3 persuasive writing and year 5 persuasive writing, we have a mean scale score of 404 for year 3 and 469, so you can see that there has been growth from 3 to 5. We can say that students have improved. Unfortunately, from the National Report of Schooling 2013, we can't identify the gain in persuasive writing. It's not actually reported. When I discovered this recently, I was thinking, is this why nobody's really paid attention to writing for all these years? Because it's not one of the key indicators that's reported. So we only get gains reported for reading and numeracy at that level in the reports. Doing a little bit of an examination of students who might be culturally different or have different backgrounds. We have that Indigenous students in Queensland are clearly looking lower than non-Indigenous students on the whole in Year 3 and in Year 5. If you look at the raw data, the raw scale data, for reading gain, you might say Indigenous students are actually getting a little bit better than the non-Indigenous students. They're improving a bit more. If you look at the data on gain in reading in the national reports. These are not statistically significant in general. And then if we look at writing, again I can present the two tables of their values and show that, yeah, people are improving and that the Indigenous students and the non-Indigenous students are both improving. Seems to be roughly the same rate, but we don't again have those gain scores for these students. We also know in gender that girls do slightly better than boys, but not significantly. Boys' gains in reading are slightly greater than girls. Girls do better than boys in persuasive writing in Year 3 and Year 5. I'll put the point differences there. And for students, interestingly, for language background other than English or English as an additional language or dialect, we don't really see any differences in reading or persuasive writing or in growth from 2011 to 2013. They're very, very close. And just the last thing is looking at geolocation, where students are in their schools. And what we see for Year 3 reading, the mean scale score differences between remote and non-remote areas is 75 points, which if you think about those previous means is a fairly large gap. For persuasive writing, 70 points. And similarly for Year 5. And for Indigenous students in geolocation, you start to get a bit of evidence of difference there. Not statistically significant in these numbers, but they're just bigger. Year 5 persuasive writing, the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students is quite large for the different areas. So my conclusions. Literacy is very complex in terms of the Australian curriculum. It's an essential learning area, but it's very rich and it has lots of different ways for students to be able to demonstrate their learning. From a data perspective, people are collecting lots of different data that may or may not align with the Australian curriculum, and I think that really we regard that as the starting point for what people should be doing in terms of differentiation. From an equity perspective, there's little guidance to teachers about how to differentiate for students in curriculum or different forms of assessment. And from a NAPLAN perspective, well, using the data we have, because it is the data we have, we still have much to find out about NAPLAN progress and different groups of students, which is the point at which I'd like to hand over to Michelle to actually demonstrate what we have been finding out.